Cowboys Midnight Song. Delilah Del Sullivan had spent years pretending to be the grieving widow, but when Gideon Carter, the deadliest bounty hunter in the West, rode into town, she knew her past was catching up with her. He stepped onto her porch, his steel-gray eyes locked onto hers. "You got a lot of folks' skin about you, Del," he murmured. "Maybe you ought to tell me why." Chapter 1. The Ghost of Abilene's Past. The dust swirled around Del's worn leather boots, a familiar dance in the relentless Abilene wind. It was the same wind that had carried the whispers of her past, the same sun that had baked the secrets into the parched earth. 5 years. 5 years she'd been Delilah Sullivan, the quiet widow of Abilene, tending to her small, respectable dress shop, a far cry from the woman who'd ridden with the notorious Blackwood gang. 5 years of burying Del, the firebrand, the outlaw, the lover of a man as dangerous as a coiled rattlesnake. She adjusted the brim of her bonnet, shielding her eyes from the glare as she watched the stagecoach rumble into town. Another cloud of dust, another set of strangers. Abilene was a transient place, a crossroads for those seeking fortune or fleeing it. Del had learned to keep her head down, her gaze averted, her secrets locked tight behind a carefully constructed facade of polite smiles and gentle nods. The shop bell chimed, a delicate, almost ironic sound considering the weight of the life she'd left behind. Mrs. Abernathy, the mayor's wife, bustled in, her ample bosom preceding her like the prow of a ship. "Morning, Del," she chirped, her voice as sharp and bright as the desert sun. "Need a new ribbon for my Sunday bonnet. Something festive. The governor's coming through next week, you know." Del forced a smile. "Of course, Mrs. Abernathy. Something festive. I have just the thing." She moved to the back of the shop, her hands tracing the familiar bolts of fabric. Silk, satin, velvet, each one a whispered lie, a soft covering for the hard truth. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the phantom touch of a worn leather saddle, the cold steel of a Colt peacemaker. She selected a vibrant crimson ribbon, the color of spilled blood, the color of a life she'd tried to forget. The irony wasn't lost on her. Mrs. Abernathy chattered on about the governor, about the town's plans, about the need to make a good impression. Del murmured appropriate responses, her mind miles away, lost in the canyons and the shadowed valleys of her memory. She'd been barely 17 when she met Jack Blackwood. He'd ridden into her life like a storm, all dark eyes and dangerous charm. He'd promised her the world, and for a while, he'd given it to her. Freedom, excitement, a love that burned hotter than the desert sun. But freedom had come at a price paid in blood and betrayal. The Blackwood gang had left a trail of broken banks and shattered lives across the territory. Del had ridden with them, her skill with a rifle honed by necessity, her heart hardened by the harsh realities of their existence. She'd seen things, done things, that would forever stain her soul. The memory of the final shootout, the one that had taken Jack's life and shattered hers, was a constant ache in her chest. The roar of gunfire, the screams, the smell of gunpowder and death. She'd barely escaped, a bullet grazing her shoulder, leaving a scar that mirrored the one on her heart. She'd reinvented herself, piece by piece. The Widow Sullivan was her masterpiece, a carefully crafted illusion designed to protect her from the ghosts of her past. But ghosts, she knew, had a way of returning. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Del sat on her small porch, sipping a cup of weak tea. The silence of the desert was a balm to her soul, a stark contrast to the chaos she'd once embraced. She closed her eyes, letting the cool evening air wash over her. A rider approached, the steady rhythm of hooves on the hard-packed earth a disruption of the quiet. Del's hand instinctively moved to her side, where a small, pearl-handled derringer was tucked into the waistband of her skirt. Old habits died hard. The rider stopped at the edge of her property, silhouetted against the fading light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a figure that exuded both power and weariness. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked towards her, his spurs clinking softly with each step. Del's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her carefully constructed world was about to shatter. The past, in the form of a man she'd hoped to never see again, loomed on her porch in the growing twilight. The air crackled with unspoken history, and the setting sun cast long, ominous shadows that danced around them like restless spirits. Chapter 2. Shadows on the Porch. He stood there, a shadow against the dying light, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. Del remained seated, her hand still resting on the hidden derringer. She didn't speak, couldn't speak. The years melted away, and she was 17 again, staring into the face of danger, her heart a wild thing trapped in her chest. He took a step closer, and the porch creaked under his weight. The scent of leather and dust, a familiar and unwelcome fragrance, filled the air. He removed his hat, holding it in one hand, and the last rays of the setting sun illuminated his face. Gideon Carter. The name echoed in her mind, a silent scream. He was older, harder, the lines around his eyes etched deeper, the scar on his cheek a stark white against his tan skin. But his eyes, those steel-gray eyes, were the same. Eyes that had seen too much, eyes that could pierce through any lie. Del, he said, his voice a low rumble, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. It wasn't a question, but a statement, an acknowledgement of the woman she'd tried so hard to bury. She finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper.
Gideon.
He didn't smile. He didn't offer any pleasantries. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering, his presence a heavy weight on the small porch. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken accusations and buried memories. You got a lot of folks' skin about you, Del, he finally said, his voice still low, still dangerous. Maybe you ought to tell me why. Her hand tightened on the derringer. She could kill him. It would be easy. A quick shot, and the threat would be gone. But the thought, the impulse, was fleeting. She was no longer that woman. She was Delilah Sullivan, the widow of Abilene. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. I'm just a dressmaker. A widow. He took another step closer, close enough that she could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed slightly. Don't play coy with me, Del. I know who you are. What you were. The words hung in the air, a challenge, a threat. Del felt a flicker of the old fire, the defiance that had kept her alive during those reckless years. But it was quickly extinguished, replaced by a weary resignation. What do you want, Gideon? She asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching, probing. I want the truth, he said. The whole truth. About Blackwood. About the money. About everything. The money. The legendary Blackwood treasure. It was the reason she'd been hunted, the reason she'd lived in fear for 5 years. It was a myth, a phantom, a story that had grown with each telling. There is no money, she said, the lie coming easily to her lips. It was a lie she'd told countless times, a lie she'd almost come to believe herself. Gideon didn't react. He simply continued to stare at her, his eyes boring into her soul. You always were a good liar, Del, he said, a hint of something that might have been admiration in his voice. But I'm a better tracker. He reached into his coat, and Del tensed, her hand ready to draw the derringer. But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a crumpled, faded photograph. He held it out to her. It was a picture of her, Jack, and the rest of the Blackwood gang. They were young, carefree, their faces full of a reckless bravado. Del was laughing, her head thrown back, her arm wrapped around Jack's waist. It was a lifetime ago, a different world. Del felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in years. Nostalgia? Regret? She wasn't sure. She took the photograph, her fingers trembling slightly. They're all gone, Gideon said, his voice softer now. Every last one of them. Except you. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. Why are you here, Gideon? She asked again, her voice laced with a vulnerability she hadn't intended to reveal. "What do you really want?" He hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Justice," he said, the word heavy with meaning. "And maybe a little bit of peace." The setting sun cast his features in stark relief, the lines of his face revealing a weariness that matched her own. The silence that followed was broken only by the chirping of crickets, a stark counterpoint to the tension that hung heavy in the air. Something in his eyes, a flicker of pain, made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Chapter 3. A bargain struck at dusk. The photograph felt heavy in Del's hand, a tangible link to a past she'd tried to erase. She stared at the young, reckless faces, at the ghost of the woman she used to be. Justice. Peace. Words that seemed foreign, almost absurd, in the context of their shared history. Justice for whom? Gideon? She asked, her voice laced with bitterness. For the banks? For the lawmen? For the ghosts of the men you hunted? He didn't flinch.
For all of them, he said.
And maybe for Jack. Jack's name, spoken aloud, sent a fresh wave of pain through her. It was a wound that had never fully healed, a scar that still throbbed with the memory of his touch, his laugh, his love. "Jack is beyond justice," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "He's beyond everything." Gideon stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Maybe," he said, "but his legacy isn't. The money, Del. Where is it?" She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to regain control of her emotions. The money, the endless questions, the constant threat. It was a burden she'd carried for too long. "I told you, there is no money," she repeated, her voice weary. "It's a story. A legend." He reached out and gently took the photograph from her hand. He studied it for a moment, his gaze lingering on Jack's face. "He trusted you, Del," he said, his voice low. "He trusted you with everything." The words struck her like a physical blow. Trust. It was a fragile thing, easily broken, easily betrayed. She had betrayed Jack's trust, not by stealing the money, but by surviving. By living a life he would never know. "What do you want me to say, Gideon?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want to hear?" He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. "I want the truth," he said. "And I want your help." Her help? The idea was ludicrous. She, Delilah Sullivan, the outlaw widow, helping Gideon Carter, the deadliest bounty hunter in the West? It was a twisted irony, a cruel joke. "Help with what?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. He took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for what he was about to say. "There's a new gang riding," he said. "They call themselves the Shadow Riders. They're ruthless, brutal. Worse than Blackwood ever was." Del felt a chill run down her spine. The Shadow Riders. She'd heard whispers of them, rumors of their savagery. They were a new breed of outlaw, a darker, more violent force. "And you think I can help you stop them?" she asked, incredulous. He nodded. "They're using Blackwood's old hideouts," he said. "His old trails. They know things only someone close to him would know." The implication was clear. He believed someone from Blackwood's past was involved, someone who knew the secrets, the hidden paths, the forgotten places. Someone like her. "You think I'm working with them?" she asked, her voice rising in anger. He shook his head. "No," he said. "But I think you know who is. And I think you can lead me to them." It was a dangerous proposition, a gamble that could cost her everything. But it was also an opportunity. A chance to finally put the past to rest, to atone for the sins of her youth, to find some measure of redemption. "And if I refuse?" she asked, testing him. He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "Then I'll find them myself," he said. "But it will be harder, bloodier.
And more innocent people will die."
The words hung in the air, a heavy weight. She knew he was right. She knew the Shadow Riders had to be stopped. And she knew, deep down, that she couldn't stand by and do nothing. The dusk deepened, the stars beginning to appear in the vast, open sky. Del looked at Gideon, at the lines of weariness and determination etched on his face. She saw a reflection of her own pain, her own longing for peace. "I'll help you," she said, the words a whisper in the gathering darkness. "But on one condition." He raised an eyebrow, waiting. "When it's over," she said, "you leave. You leave Abilene and you leave me alone. You forget you ever knew Delilah Blackwood." He considered her words, his gaze searching hers. It was a bargain struck at dusk, a pact sealed with the ghosts of the past. He nodded slowly. Agreed. The weight of the promise seemed to settle between them, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of shared history and unspoken desires. The air hummed with a newfound tension, the promise of danger, and the faint, flickering hope of redemption. Chapter 4. The Price of Silence. The agreement hung between them, a fragile truce in the gathering darkness. Dell felt a strange mix of relief and trepidation. She had made a deal with the devil, a bargain that could either save her or damn her completely. "Where do we start?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of the anxiety she felt. Gideon stepped back, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "We start with the whispers," he said. "The rumors. The names that keep surfacing." He leaned against the porch railing, his gaze sweeping the quiet street. Abilene was settling into its nightly routine. The saloons were starting to fill with noise and laughter, the faint strains of a piano drifting on the evening breeze. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, Dell knew there were secrets, hidden currents of fear and suspicion. "There's been talk of a man named Silas," Gideon said, his voice low. "He's been seen around the old Blackwood hideouts. He's recruiting, paying good money for men with certain skills." Silas. The name was unfamiliar to Dell, but the description sent a shiver of unease through her. Certain skills meant violence, ruthlessness, a willingness to kill. "He's careful," Gideon continued. "He doesn't show his face much. But he's got connections. He knows things." Dell thought for a moment, trying to piece together the fragments of information she'd overheard in the shop, the whispers she'd dismissed as idle gossip. "There's a blacksmith," she said, her voice hesitant. "Elias Thorne. He's been flush lately. Buying drinks, talking big. He used to shoe horses for Blackwood." Gideon nodded, his eyes narrowed.
Thorne.
"I've heard the name. He's got a reputation for being loose-lipped when he's drunk." It was a starting point, a thread to follow in the tangled web of the Shadow Riders. But Dell knew it was a dangerous path, one that could lead to betrayal, to violence, to the exposure of her own carefully guarded secrets. "We need to be careful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If Silas is connected to the Shadow Riders, he's not going to be easy to approach." Gideon met her gaze, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his eyes. "I know the risks, Dell," he said. "But we don't have a choice. We have to stop them." The "we" hung between them, a shared responsibility, a bond forged in the crucible of their shared past. Dell felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. A connection. A sense of purpose. "We'll talk to Thorne," she said, her voice firmer now. "But we'll do it my way. No guns. No threats. We'll get him talking, find out what he knows." Gideon hesitated, his hand instinctively moving to his Colt. He was a man of action, of direct confrontation. But he also recognized the wisdom in Dell's approach. She knew the people of Abilene, the nuances of their relationships, the subtle ways to extract information. "All right," he said, reluctantly. "Your way." "But if things go south they won't," she said, cutting him off. She had to believe that. She had to believe she could control the situation, that she could navigate the treacherous waters of her past without being consumed by them. They spent the next hour discussing their plan, their voices low, their words carefully chosen. Dell outlined the layout of the town, the relationships between the various inhabitants, the potential sources of information. Gideon listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. As the moon rose higher in the sky, casting long, silvery shadows across the porch, Dell felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had made her decision. She had chosen to face her past, to fight for the future. And she had found an unlikely ally in the man who had once been her enemy. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice firm. "We'll start tomorrow." Gideon nodded. Tomorrow. He stood up, his tall figure silhouetted against the moonlit sky. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Thank you, Dell, he said, his voice soft. The words surprised her. She hadn't expected gratitude from him. She hadn't expected anything but suspicion and mistrust. Don't thank me yet, she said, her voice tinged with a hint of bitterness. This is just the beginning. He offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. I know, he said, but it's a start. He turned and walked away, his spurs clinking softly on the wooden planks of the porch. Dell watched him go, her heart a mixture of fear and anticipation. The price of silence had been paid. The game had begun. The moon, a silent witness, cast an eerie glow on the empty porch, leaving Dell alone with her thoughts and the daunting task ahead. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Canyon. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the desert air crisp and cool. Dell rose early, her mind already racing with the day's plans. She dressed in a simple, practical riding skirt and a sturdy blouse, a stark contrast to the delicate dresses she usually wore. She strapped the pearl-handled derringer to her thigh, a familiar weight, a reminder of the danger she was facing. She met Gideon at the edge of town, near the livery stable. He was already mounted on a powerful black stallion, his saddlebags packed, his rifle secured in its scabbard. He looked every inch the bounty hunter, a figure of grim determination. Ready? He asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Dell nodded, her throat tight with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. She mounted her own horse, a sturdy mare she'd named Willow, and they set off at a steady pace, heading towards the outskirts of town. Their destination was a narrow canyon, a few miles outside of Abilene, a place where Elias Thorne often went to collect scrap metal for his forge. It was a secluded spot, a place where conversations could be held in private, away from prying eyes. The ride was silent, the only sounds the rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Dell used the time to gather her thoughts, to steel herself for the confrontation ahead. She knew Thorne was a weak link, a man easily swayed by drink and money. But he was also unpredictable, prone to fits of anger and paranoia. As they approached the canyon, Dell could hear the faint clang of metal on metal, the telltale sign of Thorne at work. The air grew thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron. Gideon reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping the canyon walls. Stay close, he said, his voice low. And let me do the talking. Dell bristled at his instruction, but she held her tongue. She knew he was right. Thorne was more likely to talk to a man, especially a man like Gideon, who exuded an air of authority and danger. They dismounted at the mouth of the canyon, leaving their horses tethered to a scrubby mesquite bush. They walked slowly, their boots crunching on the rocky ground. The sound of the hammer grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. They found Thorne working at a makeshift forge, his back to them, his hammer striking a piece of red-hot iron with rhythmic force. He was a large man, his muscles bulging, his face grimy with sweat and soot. Gideon cleared his throat, and Thorne turned around, startled. His eyes widened when he saw them, his hand instinctively moving to the heavy hammer he held. Carter, he said, his voice gruff. What brings you out here? Gideon didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering, his presence filling the small space. We need to talk, Thorne, he said, his voice calm but firm. About Silas. Thorne's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and defiance. He glanced at Dell, his expression questioning. He recognized her, of course, but he couldn't quite place her. I don't know any Silas, he said, his voice unconvincing. Gideon took a step closer, his shadow falling over Thorne. Don't lie to me, he said, his voice hardening. We know you've been talking to him. We know you've been working for him. Thorne hesitated, his gaze darting between Gideon and Dell. He was trapped, and he knew it. I might have heard the name, he stammered. But I don't know anything about him. Dell stepped forward, her voice soft, almost soothing. Elias, she said, using his first name. We're not here to hurt you. We just need information. We need to stop Silas and the Shadow Riders. Thorne looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw something there, something that made him pause. A flicker of recognition, a hint of the woman she used to be. Delilah? He whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Delilah Blackwood? The name hung in the air, a ghost from the past. Gideon turned to look at Dell, his expression unreadable. The echoes of the canyon seemed to amplify the whispered name, bouncing off the rock walls and carrying the weight of years of secrets. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the crackling of the dying embers in Thorne's forge. Chapter 6. The Sheriff's Suspicion. The revelation hung in the air, thick and heavy as the smoke from Thorne's forge. Gideon's gaze was sharp, assessing, a silent question in his steel-gray eyes. Dell held her breath, her carefully constructed facade crumbling around her. Thorne, emboldened by his discovery, took a step back, his hand still gripping the hammer. "You're supposed to be dead," he stammered, his voice a mixture of fear and awe. Dell forced a smile, a brittle, fragile thing. "Rumors of my demise have been greatly exaggerated, Elias," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. But the widow Sullivan Thorne sputtered, his confusion evident. "A necessary fiction," Dell replied, her gaze unwavering. She turned to Gideon, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I can explain," she said, her voice low. Gideon didn't speak, but his expression softened slightly. He had suspected, of course, but the confirmation was still a shock. He had been drawn to the quiet widow, to her strength, her resilience. He had seen glimpses of something more, something hidden beneath the surface. Now he understood why. "We don't have time for explanations now," Gideon said, his voice firm. "We need to get Thorne out of here. Silas will know he's talked." He turned back to Thorne, his expression hardening. "You're coming with us," he said. "We'll keep you safe." Thorne hesitated, his eyes darting between Gideon and Dell. He was caught between a rock and a hard place, between the wrath of the Shadow Riders and the uncertain protection of a bounty hunter and an outlaw widow. I don't know," he stammered. "Silas, he'll kill me." "He'll kill you if you stay," Gideon countered. "We're your only chance." Dell stepped forward, her voice softer now. "Elias," she said, "we need your help. We need to stop Silas. He's using Jack's legacy for his own twisted purposes. Don't you want to see justice done?" The mention of Jack's name seemed to strike a chord with Thorne. He looked at Dell, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and regret. He had admired Jack Blackwood, had envied his charisma, his daring. He had also betrayed him, in small ways, for money, for survival. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "I'll go with you. But I need your word. You'll protect me." "You have my word," Gideon said, his voice firm. They helped Thorne pack a few belongings. Then they mounted their horses and set off, heading back towards Abilene. They rode in silence, the tension thick between them. Dell could feel Gideon's gaze on her, questioning, assessing. She knew she owed him an explanation, but she couldn't bring herself to speak, not yet. As they approached town, they were met by a sight that made their blood run cold. Sheriff Thompson, a stern, unyielding man, was waiting for them, his posse of deputies surrounding him. "Carter," Thompson said, his voice cold. "I need to have a word with you. And with Mrs. Sullivan." Gideon reined in his horse, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "What's this about, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice calm but wary. Thompson's gaze shifted to Dell, his eyes narrowing. "I've been hearing rumors," he said. "Rumors about Mrs. Sullivan's past." Dell felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. The whispers had reached the sheriff. Her secret was out. "Rumors are just that, Sheriff," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Rumors." Thompson didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his eyes filled with suspicion. "I'm placing you both under arrest," he said. "For questioning." Gideon's hand tightened on his Colt. "On what grounds, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Obstruction of justice," Thompson replied. "Harboring a fugitive. And conspiracy." The word hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Dell knew they were trapped. She looked at Gideon, her eyes filled with despair. Their fragile alliance, Their desperate attempt to find redemption was about to be shattered. The sheriff's gaze was unwavering, a silent promise of the trouble that awaited them in the cold, unforgiving confines of the Abilene jail. Chapter 7. Secrets in the Saloon. The jail cell was cold, damp, and smelled of stale whiskey and despair. Dell sat on the narrow cot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Gideon paced the small space, his restless energy filling the confined area. Thorne huddled in a corner, his face pale, his eyes filled with fear. "We need to get out of here," Gideon said, his voice low and urgent. "Before Thompson gets back." Dell looked up at him, her expression bleak.
"How?"
she asked. "We're surrounded. He's got the whole town on his side." Gideon stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "We have friends," he said. "People who owe us favors."
Dell knew he was right.
They had both made connections in Abilene, people who respected them, who trusted them. But asking for help was a risk, a gamble that could expose them further.
"Who?"
she asked, her voice hesitant. Gideon glanced at Thorne, then back at Dell.
"Maggie," he said.
"At the Golden Barrel Saloon. She's got a good heart."
"And she owes me." "Maggie."
The owner of the Golden Barrel, a woman with a sharp tongue and a surprisingly kind soul. Dell had befriended her, sharing stories, offering a sympathetic ear. Maggie knew more about Abilene's secrets than anyone, and she had a reputation for helping those in need. "She's our best bet," Dell agreed. "But how do we get a message to her?" Gideon looked around the cell, his eyes searching for a way out. There was a small, barred window high up on the wall, too small for a man to fit through. "But Thorne," he said, turning to the blacksmith. "Can you reach that window?" Thorne looked up, his eyes widening. "Maybe," he said, his voice trembling. "But what good will that do?" "You're small enough to squeeze through," Gideon explained. "You can get to Maggie, tell her we need help." It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble. But it was their only chance. Thorne hesitated, his fear evident. But he also knew that his life depended on it. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." With Gideon's help, Thorne managed to climb up to the window, his hands scraping against the rough stone. He squeezed through the bars, his body contorting, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He dropped to the ground outside, disappearing into the darkness. Dell and Gideon waited, their hearts pounding, their ears straining for any sound. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence of the jail was broken only by the occasional cough or groan from other prisoners. Finally, they heard a faint tapping at the cell door. Gideon moved quickly, his hand on his Colt. He opened the door a crack, peering out. It was Maggie, her face hidden in the shadows, her eyes wide with concern.
"Gideon," she whispered.
"Are you all right?" "We're fine," Gideon replied. "But we need your help. We're trapped." Maggie quickly outlined her plan. She had bribed one of the deputies, a young man with a gambling problem, to look the other way. She had horses waiting at the back of the jail and a safe passage out of town. "It's risky," she warned. "But it's your only chance." Gideon nodded. "We'll take it." With Maggie's help, they slipped out of the cell, moving silently through the darkened corridors of the jail. They reached the back door, where two horses were waiting, their reins held by a shadowy figure. It was a young woman, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Dell recognized her instantly. Sarah, one of the girls who worked at the saloon, a girl with a quick wit and a rebellious spirit. "Sarah?" Dell whispered, surprised. Sarah smiled, a flash of white teeth in the darkness. "Maggie asked me to help," she said. "She said you were in trouble." They mounted the horses and rode out of town, the darkness swallowing them whole. They rode in silence, the only sound the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves. Dell looked back at Abilene, at the flickering lights of the town, at the jail where she had almost lost everything. She had escaped for now, but the danger was far from over. The secrets of the saloon had provided a temporary reprieve, but the road ahead was still shrouded in darkness and uncertainty. They were fugitives now, with the law and a ruthless gang on their trail. Chapter 8. The Bounty Hunter's Scar. They rode through the night, pushing their horses hard, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Abilene. The vast, open landscape swallowed them whole, the stars their only companions. Dell felt a strange sense of freedom, a release from the constraints of her carefully constructed life. But it was a freedom tinged with fear, with the knowledge that they were hunted, that their every move was fraught with danger. As dawn approached, they reached a small, secluded canyon, a place Dell remembered from her days with the Blackwood gang. It was a hidden oasis, a place where they could rest, regroup, and plan their next move. They dismounted, their bodies stiff and sore from the long ride. Gideon tended to the horses, his movements efficient and practiced. Dell built a small fire, the flames flickering and dancing, casting shadows on the canyon walls. They sat in silence, sharing a meager breakfast of dried meat and hardtack. The tension between them was palpable. Dell knew she owed Gideon an explanation, a reckoning of her past. "I never meant to deceive you, Gideon," she said, her voice low, her gaze fixed on the flames.
I needed to survive."
He looked at her, his steel-gray eyes softened by the firelight.
"I understand," he said.
"Survival is a powerful motivator." She told him her story, the whole story, from the moment she met Jack Blackwood to the day she became Delilah Sullivan. She spoke of the thrill of the ride, the freedom of the open road, the love that had burned so brightly and so briefly. She also spoke of the guilt, the regret, the constant fear of discovery. Gideon listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He simply listened, absorbing her words, understanding the weight of her burden. "I've lived with the lies for so long," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I almost forgot who I was." He reached out and gently touched her hand, his fingers calloused but warm. "You're not alone, Dell," he said. "We all have our secrets, our scars." He told her about his own past, about the loss of his family, about the years he'd spent hunting down the men responsible. He spoke of the emptiness that had consumed him, the relentless pursuit of justice that had become his only purpose. "The scar on my cheek," he said, touching the raised white line that ran from his temple to his jaw. "It's a reminder of what I've lost and what I've sworn to protect." Dell saw a vulnerability in him she hadn't seen before, a shared pain that bridged the gap between them. They were both survivors, both scarred by the harsh realities of the frontier. "What do we do now, Gideon?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. "We can't go back to Abilene." He looked at her, his eyes hardening with determination. "We find Silas," he said. "We stop the Shadow Riders. And we clear your name." It was a daunting task, a seemingly impossible mission. But Dell felt a flicker of hope, a renewed sense of purpose. She had found an ally in Gideon, a partner in this dangerous game. "We'll do it together," she said, her voice firm. He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Together. The shared vulnerability, the unspoken understanding, had forged a new connection between them. The fire crackled merrily, casting a warm glow on their faces, a small beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The bounty hunter's scar, a symbol of his past, now seemed to be a testament to his resilience, a quality that mirrored her own. They were bound together, not just by circumstance, but by a shared understanding of loss and a fierce determination to find redemption. Chapter 9. A Ride Through the Storm. The sun climbed higher, baking the canyon walls, the heat radiating in waves. Dell and Gideon knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Silas and the Shadow Riders would be searching for them, and Sheriff Thompson wouldn't be far behind. "We need to move," Gideon said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to find out where Silas is hiding." Dell nodded, her mind racing.
"Thorne mentioned a place," she said.
"An old abandoned mine, north of here. He said Silas was using it as a base of operations." It was a long shot, a dangerous gamble. But it was the only lead they had. They packed their meager belongings, saddled their horses, and set off, heading north into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The landscape was harsh and desolate, a tapestry of rock and sand, of scrubby bushes and towering cacti. The sun beat down on them mercilessly, the heat shimmering on the horizon. As they rode, a storm began to gather, the clouds rolling in, dark and ominous. The wind picked up, whipping their hair, stinging their eyes with dust and sand. The sky turned a sickly green, the air thick with the smell of ozone. "We need to find shelter," Del shouted above the wind. Gideon scanned the horizon, his eyes searching for any sign of cover. He spotted a small, rocky outcrop, a shallow cave that might offer some protection from the storm. They urged their horses towards the outcrop, the wind howling around them, the first fat drops of rain beginning to fall. They reached the cave just as the storm broke, the rain lashing down, the thunder roaring, the lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, terrifying flashes. They huddled together in the cave, their horses sheltered behind them, the wind and rain a deafening roar. The storm raged for hours, a violent display of nature's power. Del felt a sense of awe, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She looked at Gideon, his face illuminated by the flashes of lightning. He was calm, steady, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. He was a man built for storms, a man who had weathered the worst that life could throw at him. "It reminds me of the night Jack died," she said, her voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. Gideon looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. "Storms always bring back memories," he said. They talked for hours, sharing stories, memories, the unspoken fears that haunted them. The storm became a backdrop for their conversation, a shared experience that forged a deeper bond between them. As the storm began to subside, the rain softening to a drizzle, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of moon, Del felt a shift in her relationship with Gideon. The fear, the suspicion, the resentment had begun to fade, replaced by a growing trust, a nascent affection. "Thank you, Gideon," she said, her voice soft, "for believing in me." He met her gaze, his eyes holding hers. "I see you, Del," he said, "the real you. And I believe in you." The words hung in the air, a silent promise, a fragile hope. The storm had washed away the dust, the lies, the pretense, revealing the raw, vulnerable truth of their shared humanity. As the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, they emerged from the cave, their clothes damp, their bodies weary, but their spirits renewed. The ride through the storm had tested them, challenged them, but it had also brought them closer together. They were ready to face whatever lay ahead, their bond strengthened by the shared experience, their determination fueled by the promise of a new beginning. Chapter 10. The Unveiling of Truth. The storm had cleared the air, leaving the desert smelling fresh and clean. The rising sun cast long shadows, painting the landscape in vibrant colors. Del and Gideon rode in silence, their minds focused on the task ahead. The abandoned mine loomed in the distance, a dark scar on the face of the earth. As they approached, they could hear the sounds of activity, the clang of metal, the muffled voices of men. Gideon reined in his horse, his hand signaling for Del to stop. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice low. "There's no telling how many men Silas has." Del nodded, her heart pounding. She could feel the familiar adrenaline rush, the heightened senses, the awareness of danger. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, a reminder of her past life. They dismounted, leaving their horses hidden in a small ravine. They moved slowly, cautiously, using the rocks and scrub brush for cover. They reached the edge of the mine, peering down into the darkness. They could see a group of men gathered around a campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Silas was there, his back to them, his voice a low rumble. He was a tall, imposing figure, his shoulders broad, his presence radiating power and menace. "We need to get closer," Gideon whispered. "We need to hear what they're planning." Del nodded, her hand moving to the derringer hidden beneath her skirt. They crept closer, their movements silent, their senses alert. They reached a position behind a large pile of rocks, close enough to hear the conversation. Silas was outlining his plan, his voice filled with a chilling ruthlessness. He was planning to rob the stagecoach carrying the governor, a brazen and audacious act that would undoubtedly result in bloodshed. "We'll hit them at Dead Man's Pass," Silas said. "It's the perfect ambush spot."
No escape.
Dead Man's Pass. A narrow, treacherous canyon, a place where many travelers had met their end.
Dell knew it well.
It was a place where the Blackwood gang had often laid in wait, a place of violence and death. Gideon's hand tightened on his Colt. He was ready to act, to confront Silas and his men. But Dell stopped him. "Wait," she whispered. "We need to know more. There's something familiar about this." She listened intently, her mind sifting through the details, searching for a clue, a connection. And then she heard it.
A name.
A name that sent a chill down her spine.
"Bartholomew," Silas said.
"You'll be in charge of the explosives. Make sure the pass is blocked."
No survives.
Bartholomew. The name echoed in Dell's mind. It was the name of Jack Blackwood's younger brother, a man she had believed to be dead. A man who had been consumed by hatred and revenge. She turned to Gideon, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's Bartholomew," she whispered. "He's alive. He's Silas." Gideon's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The knowledge of Blackwood's hideouts, the use of his old trails, the ruthless efficiency of the Shadow Riders.
It all made sense now.
"He's using Jack's legacy to fuel his own vendetta," Dell said, her voice filled with anger and betrayal. "He's twisting everything Jack stood for." Gideon nodded, his jaw clenched. "We have to stop him," he said, "before he kills more innocent people." The unveiling of the truth had changed everything. It was no longer just about stopping a gang of outlaws. It was about confronting a ghost from the past, a man driven by hatred and revenge. It was about protecting Jack Blackwood's legacy, about reclaiming her own identity. The stakes were higher, the danger more personal. The mine, a symbol of forgotten dreams and buried secrets, had become the stage for a final confrontation. Chapter 11. Blood on the Prairie. The revelation of Bartholomew's identity had ignited a fire in Dell, a fierce determination to stop him, to protect Jack's memory from his brother's twisted ambition. Gideon, seeing the resolve in her eyes, felt a surge of respect and a deepening sense of their shared purpose. "We need a plan," Gideon said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't just rush in there." Dell nodded, her mind racing. She knew the layout of the mine, the hidden tunnels, the escape routes. She had spent countless hours there with Jack, exploring its depths, dreaming of a future that had never come to be. "There's an old ventilation shaft," she said. "It leads to the main chamber. We can use it to get behind them, take them by surprise." It was a risky plan, a dangerous gamble, but it was their best chance. They crept through the darkness, their movements silent, their senses alert. They reached the entrance to the ventilation shaft, a narrow opening hidden behind a pile of rocks. Dell squeezed through first, her body contorting, her clothes scraping against the rough stone. Gideon followed, his larger frame making the passage even more difficult. The air inside the shaft was thick and stale, the darkness absolute. They moved slowly, cautiously, their hands guiding them along the narrow walls. They could hear the muffled sounds of the men below, their voices echoing through the tunnels. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the end of the shaft, a small opening that overlooked the main chamber. They could see Bartholomew and his men gathered around the campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Bartholomew was pacing back and forth, his voice raised in anger, his words laced with venom. "We'll show them," he was saying. "We'll show them what happens when they cross the Blackwood name. We'll make them pay." Gideon drew his Colt, his hand steady, his eyes focused. Dell reached for the derringer hidden beneath her skirt, her heart pounding. It was time. Gideon kicked out the remaining rocks blocking the shaft, and they dropped into the chamber, their guns drawn. The men around the campfire turned, startled, their hands moving to their weapons. "Bartholomew!" Dell shouted, her voice ringing out in the cavernous space. "It's over." Bartholomew turned, his eyes widening in disbelief. He recognized her instantly, his face contorting in a mixture of hatred and rage. "Delilah?" He snarled.
You should have stayed dead.
I'm here to stop you, Bartholomew, she said, her voice firm. You're not Jack. You'll never be Jack. A gunfight erupted, the roar of the guns echoing through the mine, the flashes of light illuminating the scene in brief, terrifying bursts. Dell and Gideon fought side by side, their movements synchronized, their aim true. They were outnumbered, but they were determined. Men fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Dell fought with a ferocity she hadn't felt in years, a rage fueled by betrayal and a desperate need for redemption. Bartholomew, seeing his men falling, his plan unraveling, charged at Dell, his eyes filled with murderous intent. Gideon fired, his bullet striking Bartholomew in the shoulder, spinning him around. But Bartholomew kept coming, his hand reaching for a knife hidden in his boot. Dell fired the derringer, the small gun bucking in her hand. The bullet struck Bartholomew in the chest, stopping him in his tracks. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and pain. He stumbled backward, falling to the ground, his body still. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader dead, surrendered, their weapons dropping to the ground. The blood on the prairie, a testament to Bartholomew's twisted ambition, marked the end of the Shadow Riders. Silence descended upon the mine, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. The battle was over.
But the cost had been high.
Chapter 12. The Outlaw's Code. The aftermath of the gunfight was a scene of grim devastation. Bodies lay scattered around the mine, the air heavy with the scent of blood and gunpowder. Dell stood over Bartholomew's lifeless form, her chest heaving, her hands trembling. She felt a mixture of relief and sorrow, of victory and loss. Gideon approached her, his face grim, his guns still smoking. He looked at Bartholomew's body, then at Dell, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and respect. It's over, he said, his voice low.
You did it, Dell.
She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. It shouldn't have ended this way, she said, her voice choked with emotion. He was Jack's brother. Gideon placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. He chose his path, Dell, he said. He chose violence and hatred. You chose a different path. The surviving members of the Shadow Riders were rounded up, their hands bound, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and resignation. They were a sorry lot, a collection of desperate men lured by the promise of easy money and a misguided loyalty to a false legacy. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape, Sheriff Thompson and his posse arrived, drawn by the sound of the gunfire. They were stunned by the scene that greeted them, the bodies, the captured outlaws, the evidence of a bloody battle. Thompson looked at Dell and Gideon, his expression a mixture of suspicion and grudging admiration. What happened here? He asked, his voice gruff. Gideon stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. We stopped the Shadow Riders, Sheriff, he said. They were planning to rob the stagecoach, to kill the governor. He explained everything, the connection to Bartholomew, the use of Blackwood's old hideouts, the plan to ambush the stagecoach at Dead Man's Pass. He presented the evidence, the weapons, the explosives, the map outlining the planned attack. Thompson listened intently, his eyes narrowing. He had underestimated Dell and Gideon, had dismissed them as a widow with a questionable past and a bounty hunter with a reputation for ruthlessness. He had been wrong. You saved a lot of lives today, Thompson said, his voice grudgingly respectful, including the governor's. He turned to his deputies, his voice hardening. Take these men into custody, he said, and see that they're brought to justice. As the deputies led the captured outlaws away, Thompson turned back to Dell, his gaze softening slightly. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, his voice almost gentle. I owe you an apology. I misjudged you. Dell met his gaze, her head held high. Apology accepted, Sheriff, she said. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the complexities of justice, of the blurred lines between law and outlaw. Dell had lived outside the law, had broken the rules, had made choices that had haunted her for years. But she had also redeemed herself, had fought for what was right, had risked her life to protect others. The outlaw's code, the unwritten rules that governed the lives of those who lived on the fringes of society, had been tested and ultimately upheld. Dell had broken the code by betraying her past, but she had also honored it by fighting for justice, by protecting the innocent. She was neither wholly innocent nor wholly guilty, a complex figure shaped by the harsh realities of the frontier. The sun, now fully risen, bathed the scene in a golden light, a silent promise of a new day, a new beginning. The mine, once a symbol of violence and death, now stood as a testament to courage and redemption. Chapter 13. A Letter from the Grave. With the Shadow Riders defeated and the outlaws in custody, Dell and Gideon returned to Abilene. The town, initially wary and suspicious, now greeted them with a mixture of relief and gratitude. Dell's shop, which had been shunned during her arrest, was once again bustling with customers, their whispers replaced by words of admiration and respect. Dell, however, found it difficult to settle back into her routine. The events of the past few days had changed her, had shaken her to her core. She had confronted her past, had faced her demons, and had emerged stronger, but also scarred. One evening, as she was closing up shop, Maggie from the Golden Barrel Saloon came to visit. She held a small, worn wooden box in her hands, her expression somber. "This was found among Bartholomew's belongings," Maggie said, her voice low. "The sheriff asked me to give it to you." Dell took the box, her hands trembling. She recognized it instantly. It was Jack Blackwood's box, a small chest where he kept his most prized possessions. She hadn't seen it since his death, had assumed it had been lost or stolen. She opened the box, her heart pounding. Inside, she found a collection of mementos, a faded photograph of her and Jack, a lock of her hair, a small, silver locket, and a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, addressed to her, in Jack's familiar handwriting. Dell's breath caught in her throat. A letter from the grave. She unfolded the paper, her hands shaking, her eyes blurring with tears. The letter was dated a few days before Jack's death. He wrote of his love for her, of his dreams for their future, of his regret for the life he had chosen. He wrote of the money, the legendary Blackwood treasure, revealing its true location. It wasn't a vast fortune, as the rumors suggested, but a small stash of gold, enough to start a new life, enough to escape the outlaw world. "My dearest Dell," the letter read, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused you, for the life I've dragged you into. I want you to have a chance at happiness, a chance at a normal life. The money is hidden in the old oak tree at the edge of Miller's Creek. It's not much, but it's yours. Use it to start over, to build a new life. Forget me, Dell. Forget the Blackwood name. Find someone who will love you, who will protect you. Be happy." The words were a balm to her soul, a final message of love and forgiveness. Jack had known, in his heart, that his life was coming to an end. He had wanted to protect her, to give her a future, even in death. Dell closed her eyes, clutching the letter to her chest. The tears flowed freely, tears of grief, of regret, of relief. The money was meaningless to her now. She had found her own way, had built her own life. But the letter, Jack's final words, were priceless. She shared the letter with Gideon, her voice choked with emotion. He read it silently, his eyes filled with understanding. "He loved you, Dell," Gideon said, his voice soft. "He wanted you to be happy." "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I loved him." The letter from the grave had brought closure, had resolved the lingering questions, the unspoken regrets. It had also strengthened the bond between Dell and Gideon, a bond forged in shared loss, in mutual respect, in a growing affection. The past was finally laid to rest, the ghost silenced. A new chapter was beginning, a chapter filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. The setting sun cast a warm glow on the letter, illuminating Jack's final words of love and sacrifice, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart. Chapter 14. The Reunion. The discovery of Jack's letter and the truth about the Blackwood treasure brought a sense of peace to Dell. It was a final farewell, a release from the burdens of the past. She decided to use the money to help the people of Abilene, to build a small schoolhouse, a place where children could learn, grow, and have a chance at a better future. Gideon, his mission accomplished, prepared to leave Abilene. He had brought justice to the territory, had helped Dell clear her name, and had found a measure of peace himself. But leaving wasn't easy. He had grown to care for Dell, to admire her strength, her resilience, her spirit. He found her at the construction site of the new schoolhouse, overseeing the work, her face radiant with purpose. He watched her for a moment unnoticed, admiring the way she interacted with the workers, her voice firm but kind, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. He approached her, his spurs clinking softly on the hard, packed ground. She turned, her face lighting up with a smile.
"Gideon," she said, her voice warm.
"What are you doing here?" "I came to say goodbye," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I'm heading out." Her smile faded, replaced by a look of sadness.
"So soon?" she asked.
He nodded. "My work here is done," he said. "It's time for me to move on." They stood in silence for a moment, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Dell felt a pang of loss, a sense of emptiness at the thought of his departure. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to his strength, to his quiet companionship. "I'll miss you, Gideon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. "I'll miss you too, Dell," he said. "More than you know." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her face. It was a tender gesture, a moment of vulnerability that spoke volumes. "You've built a good life here, Dell," he said. "You've found your place." She nodded, her eyes welling with tears.
"Thanks to you," she said.
"You helped me find my way back." He smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile.
"You always had it in you, Dell," he said.
"You just needed to remember." He took a step back, his hand dropping to his side. He was about to turn and walk away, to ride out of her life, when she stopped him.
"Gideon," she said, her voice hesitant.
"Don't go." He turned back to her, his eyes questioning. "Stay," she said, her voice firmer now. "Stay with me. Stay in Abilene." The words hung in the air, a plea, an invitation, a declaration of love. Gideon's heart pounded in his chest. He had longed to hear those words, had dreamed of a life with her, but he had never dared to hope. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeing the vulnerability, the longing, the love that mirrored his own. He had spent his life wandering, hunting, seeking justice, always alone. He had never allowed himself to dream of a home, of a family, of a love that could heal his wounded soul. But here, in this small, dusty town, in the arms of this extraordinary woman, he had found something he had never expected to find. He had found a home. He took a step towards her, closing the distance between them. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears that streamed down her cheeks. "Are you sure, Dell?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. "Are you sure you want a man like me, a man with a past like mine?" She nodded, her eyes shining with love. "I'm sure," she said. "I want you, Gideon. All of you. Your past, your scars, your strength, your heart. I want it all." He leaned down and kissed her, a tender, passionate kiss that sealed their fate, that bound their hearts together. It was a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of redemption, of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places. It was a reunion, not of two strangers, but of two souls who had found their way back to each other, a promise of a future filled with hope and happiness. The construction of the schoolhouse, a symbol of new beginnings, continued around them, a testament to the power of love and second chances. Chapter 15. Flames of Deception. The news of Dell and Gideon's decision to stay in Abilene spread quickly through the town. Most were happy for them, celebrating their newfound love and the promise of a brighter future. But not everyone shared in the joy. Sheriff Thompson, though he had apologized to Dell and acknowledged her bravery, still harbored suspicions. He couldn't quite reconcile the image of the quiet widow with the notorious outlaw, Delilah Blackwood. He also felt a sense of unease about Gideon Carter, a man known for his ruthlessness, a man who lived by the gun. One evening, a fire broke out at the newly constructed schoolhouse. The flames leaped high into the night sky, consuming the wooden structure, destroying the hopes and dreams of the community. Dell and Gideon rushed to the scene, their hearts sinking as they watched the fire rage, the efforts of the townsfolk to extinguish it proving futile. Thompson arrived, his face grim, his eyes filled with suspicion. He looked at Dell and Gideon, his gaze accusing. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice harsh. "We don't know," Dell said, her voice choked with emotion. "We were at home when we saw the smoke." Thompson wasn't convinced. He had received an anonymous tip, a whispered message suggesting that the fire was no accident, that Dell and Gideon were responsible. "I'm placing you both under arrest," he said, his voice cold. "For arson." Dell and Gideon were stunned. They had been through so much, had fought so hard to build a new life, to find peace and happiness. And now, they were being accused of destroying the very thing they had helped to create. "This is insane, Sheriff," Gideon said, his voice dangerously low. "We would never do this." "We'll see about that," Thompson replied, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "I have evidence. Witnesses." The witnesses were a collection of disgruntled townsfolk, people who had grudges against Dell and Gideon, people who were jealous of their happiness, people who were easily swayed by rumors and suspicion. They were taken to the jail, the same jail where they had been held before, the same cell where they had plotted their escape. The irony was bitter, the injustice palpable. Dell sat on the cot, her head in her hands, her spirit broken. Gideon paced the cell, his anger simmering, his frustration mounting. "We need to find out who did this, Dell," he said, his voice tight with determination. "We need to clear our names." Dell looked up at him, her eyes filled with despair.
"How?"
she asked. "Everyone believes we're guilty." Gideon stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with a fierce resolve. "We'll find the truth," he said. "We always do." The flames of deception had engulfed their newfound happiness, casting a shadow of doubt and suspicion over their lives. They were trapped, once again, in a web of lies and accusations. But they were not defeated. They had faced adversity before, had overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. They would fight for their freedom, for their love, for their future. The jail cell, a symbol of confinement and despair, would not be their end. It would be the starting point of another battle, another quest for justice. Chapter 16. A Standoff at Dawn. Inside the jail cell, Dell and Gideon began to piece together the fragments of information, searching for a clue, a connection, anything that could lead them to the true arsonist. They knew they were being framed, but by whom and why? "It has to be someone who knew about the money," Dell said, her voice thoughtful. "Someone who resented us using it for the schoolhouse." Gideon nodded, his mind racing. "Someone who wanted to see us fail," he added. "Someone who wanted to destroy everything we've built." They considered the possibilities, the enemies they had made, the grudges that might still linger. The list was long, but one name kept surfacing. "Thompson," Gideon said, his voice low and dangerous. "He never trusted us. He never believed in us." Dell hesitated.
"But why?" she asked.
"He apologized. He acknowledged our help."
"Maybe it was all an act," Gideon said.
"Maybe he's been plotting against us all along."
It was a long shot, a dangerous accusation, but it was the only lead they had.
They decided to confront Thompson, to force him to reveal the truth. They knew it was a risky move, a gamble that could cost them their lives. But they were desperate. With the help of Maggie, who had once again come to their aid, they managed to smuggle a message to Thompson, challenging him to a meeting, a standoff at dawn, at the ruins of the schoolhouse. The dawn broke cold and gray, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Dell and Gideon stood amidst the charred remains of the schoolhouse, their faces grim, their hands resting on their guns. Thompson arrived, his posse of deputies surrounding him, their rifles drawn. "What is the meaning of this, Carter?" Thompson demanded, his voice harsh. "We know you set the fire, Thompson," Gideon said, his voice calm but firm. "We know you framed us." Thompson scoffed. "You have no proof," he said. "We have a witness," Dell said, stepping forward. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Sarah, the young woman from the saloon, her face pale, her eyes filled with fear. "I saw him," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I saw Sheriff Thompson set the fire. He paid me to lie, to say I saw Dell and Gideon do it." Thompson's face turned pale. He had been exposed. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled. "You're lying," he snarled, his hand moving to his gun. "Don't do it, Thompson," Gideon warned, his Colt leveled at the sheriff. A tense standoff ensued, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant rumble of thunder. The deputies, uncertain, hesitated, their loyalty to their sheriff wavering. Thompson, realizing he was cornered, made a desperate move. He drew his gun, firing at Gideon. The bullet grazed Gideon's arm, but he didn't flinch. He fired back, his shot hitting Thompson squarely in the chest. Thompson fell to the ground, his body lifeless. The deputies, seeing their leader dead, lowered their weapons, surrendering. The truth had been revealed. Thompson, driven by jealousy and a thirst for power, had tried to destroy Dell and Gideon, to frame them for a crime they didn't commit. He had failed. The standoff at dawn had ended in bloodshed, but it had also brought justice. Dell and Gideon were exonerated, their names cleared, their reputations restored. The rain began to fall, a gentle cleansing rain, washing away the ashes, the lies, the deception. The ruins of the schoolhouse, a testament to betrayal and revenge, now stood as a symbol of resilience and the triumph of truth. The air was thick with tension, but also with a sense of relief, a feeling that justice, though delayed, had finally prevailed. Chapter 17. The Hidden Ledger. With Thompson's death and the exposure of his treachery, a wave of relief washed over Abilene. The townsfolk, ashamed of their quickness to judge, rallied around Dell and Gideon, offering apologies and support. The rebuilding of the schoolhouse became a community effort, a symbol of unity and forgiveness. However, questions still lingered. Why had Thompson been so determined to frame them? What had fueled his resentment? Dell and Gideon decided to search Thompson's office, hoping to find answers, to understand the depth of his deception. They found the sheriff's office in disarray, papers scattered, drawers pulled open, a clear sign of Thompson's desperate attempt to cover his tracks. As they sifted through the mess, Dell discovered a hidden compartment behind a bookshelf. Inside, she found a small, leather-bound ledger. She opened the ledger, her heart pounding. The pages were filled with names, dates, and amounts of money, a meticulous record of Thompson's illicit dealings. He had been taking bribes from various outlaws and criminals, protecting them from the law, enriching himself at the expense of the community. As Dell read further, she discovered a shocking connection. Thompson had been working with Bartholomew, providing him with information, helping him to evade capture. He had been a silent partner in the Shadow Riders, a corrupt lawman fueling the violence and chaos that had plagued the territory. The ledger also revealed Thompson's motive for framing Dell and Gideon. He had feared their growing influence in Abilene, their commitment to justice, their potential to expose his corruption. He had seen them as a threat to his power, to his ill-gotten gains. The hidden ledger was the final piece of the puzzle, the definitive proof of Thompson's guilt. It was a damning indictment of a man who had betrayed his oath, who had abused his power, who had caused so much pain and suffering. Dell and Gideon presented the ledger to the town council, the evidence irrefutable. The council, shocked and outraged by Thompson's betrayal, moved swiftly to appoint a new sheriff, a man of integrity and honesty. The discovery of the ledger brought closure, a final resolution to the lingering questions and doubts. It also reinforced Dell and Gideon's commitment to justice, their determination to build a better future for Abilene. They decided to donate the money Thompson had stolen to the rebuilding of the schoolhouse, turning his ill-gotten gains into a symbol of hope and opportunity. The ledger, a record of corruption and deceit, became a testament to the power of truth and the importance of accountability. As the sun set, casting a warm golden light over the newly rebuilt schoolhouse, Dell and Gideon stood hand in hand, their hearts filled with a sense of peace and accomplishment. They had faced adversity, had overcome betrayal, had emerged stronger and more united. The hidden ledger, a secret that had threatened to destroy them, had ultimately brought them closer together, reinforcing their commitment to each other and to the community they had chosen to call home. Chapter 18. Betrayal in the Moonlight. The schoolhouse was complete, a beacon of hope and learning in the heart of Abilene. Dell and Gideon, their lives intertwined with the town's fate, felt a sense of peace they hadn't known before. But the tranquility was shattered one moonlit night. A rider arrived, his horse lathered in sweat, his face etched with fear. He brought news that sent a chill down Dell's spine. A group of outlaws, claiming to be former members of the Blackwood Gang, had gathered at the old canyon hideout. They were demanding the release of the captured Shadow Riders, threatening to burn Abilene to the ground if their demands weren't met. Dell and Gideon knew this was no idle threat. These were desperate men, driven by a misguided loyalty to a dead leader. They had to be stopped. As they prepared to ride out, Maggie approached them, her face etched with worry. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice low. "The leader of these outlaws, he calls himself Reno." Dell felt a jolt of recognition. Reno. It was a name she hadn't heard in years, a name that belonged to a man she had once considered a friend, a man who had ridden with Jack Blackwood, a man she had believed to be dead. "Reno is alive?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Maggie nodded. "And he's blaming you for Jack's death," she said. "He's out for revenge." The revelation hit Dell like a physical blow. Reno, a man she had trusted, a man she had shared laughter and hardship with, was now her enemy. He had betrayed her, had twisted the past, had used Jack's memory to fuel his own twisted agenda. They rode through the night, the moonlight casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves. Dell's mind raced, replaying memories of Reno, searching for clues, for any sign of the darkness that had consumed him. They reached the canyon hideout, the same place where they had confronted Bartholomew, the same place where so much blood had been spilled. They could see the outlaws gathered around a campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Reno was there, his back to them, his voice a low growl. "We'll give them 1 hour," Reno was saying. "If the prisoners aren't released, we burn the town. We'll show them what happens when they cross the Blackwood name." Gideon drew his Colt, his hand steady, his eyes focused. Dell reached for the derringer hidden beneath her skirt, her heart pounding. It was time to confront another ghost from the past, another betrayal in the moonlight. "Reno!" Dell shouted, her voice ringing out in the stillness of the night. Reno turned, his eyes widening in surprise. He recognized her instantly, his face contorting in a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "Delilah," he snarled. "You're alive." The betrayal in the moonlight was complete. The past had returned, not as a memory, but as a living, breathing threat. The stage was set for another confrontation, another battle between loyalty and betrayal, between justice and revenge. Chapter 19. The Long Road to Redemption. Reno's face twisted in a snarl, his eyes burning with hatred. "You betrayed us, Delilah," he spat. "You left Jack to die." Dell stood firm, her gaze unwavering. "That's a lie, Reno," she said, her voice strong and clear. "You know it." "I know what I saw," Reno retorted. "I saw you run. I saw you leave him behind." Gideon stepped forward, his Colt leveled at Reno. "Jack's dead, Reno," he said. "Let it go." Reno ignored Gideon, his eyes locked on Dell. "You were always a coward," he sneered. "You never had the stomach for the life." Dell felt a surge of anger, but she kept her composure. She knew Reno was trying to provoke her, to goad her into making a mistake. "This isn't about Jack, Reno," she said. "This is about you. About your own twisted need for revenge." She explained everything about Bartholomew, about the Shadow Riders, about Thompson's corruption. She told him about Jack's letter, about his final wish for her to have a new life, a life free from violence and bloodshed. Reno listened, his expression unreadable. The other outlaws, uncertain, shifted their weight, their hands hovering over their weapons. You expect me to believe that? Reno scoffed. After all this time? It's the truth, Reno, Dell said, her voice pleading. Look at what you're doing. You're destroying everything Jack stood for. You're becoming the very thing he hated. A flicker of doubt crossed Reno's face. He remembered Jack, his charisma, his leadership, his code of honor. He remembered the good times, the camaraderie, the shared dreams. He had twisted those memories, had used them to justify his own bitterness and rage. He looked at Dell, at the woman she had become, the strength she had shown, the life she had built. He saw a reflection of the woman Jack had loved, the woman he had once admired. He lowered his gun, his shoulders slumping. Maybe you're right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The tension in the canyon eased. The other outlaws, following Reno's lead, lowered their weapons. It's over, Reno, Gideon said, his voice firm but gentle. Let it go. Start over. Reno looked at Gideon, then at Dell, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and relief. He had been living in the past, consumed by hatred and revenge. He had almost destroyed everything, had almost become the very thing he despised. What do we do now? He asked, his voice lost. Dell stepped forward, her hand outstretched. We rebuild, she said. We honor Jack's memory by building a better future. The long road to redemption had begun. Reno and the remaining outlaws surrendered, turning themselves into the new sheriff. They would face justice for their crimes, but they would also have a chance to start over, to find their own path to redemption. As the sun rose, casting a warm golden light over the canyon, Dell and Gideon stood together, their hands clasped, their hearts filled with hope. They had faced another betrayal, another challenge, and had emerged stronger, their love deepened by the shared experience. The ghosts of the past were finally laid to rest, the cycle of violence broken. A new chapter had begun, a chapter filled with promise, with forgiveness, with the enduring power of love and redemption. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The air in Abilene was different now. The fear and suspicion that had once hung heavy in the streets had dissipated, replaced by a sense of unity and purpose. The schoolhouse stood tall and proud, a symbol of the town's resilience and Dell and Gideon's unwavering commitment to a better future. Dell and Gideon had found peace, their lives intertwined with the fabric of the community. They had faced their pasts, had conquered their demons, and had built a life together based on love, trust, and mutual respect. One evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the vast, open landscape, Gideon turned to Dell, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. I've been thinking, he said, his voice low and husky. About us. About our future. Dell smiled, her heart swelling with love. What about it? She asked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple, elegant ring, a single diamond sparkling in the fading light. Delilah Sullivan, he said, his voice filled with emotion. Will you marry me? Tears welled up in Dell's eyes, tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love that had defied all odds. She had never dared to dream of such happiness, had never believed she deserved such a love. Yes, Gideon, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling slightly. It was a perfect fit, a symbol of their enduring love, of their commitment to each other. They kissed, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their vows, that spoke of a future filled with promise, with hope, with a love that would last a lifetime. The wedding was a simple, heartfelt affair, attended by the entire town. Maggie, Sarah, and even the former sheriff's deputies were there. Even Reno, who had served a short time and made good on his word, came to the wedding. Dell wore a simple, elegant dress, her hair adorned with wildflowers. Gideon wore a new suit, his face radiant with happiness. As they stood before the newly appointed sheriff, exchanging their vows, Dell felt a sense of completeness, of belonging, that she had never known before. She had found her home, her family, her love. "I, Delilah, take you, Gideon, to be my husband," she said, her voice clear and strong. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. I, Gideon, take you, Delilah, to be my wife," he said, his voice equally firm. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." They exchanged rings, a symbol of their eternal love, of their unbreakable bond. The sheriff pronounced them husband and wife, and the town erupted in cheers. As they walked hand in hand through the cheering crowd, Dell and Gideon knew that their journey had been long and arduous, filled with danger, with betrayal, with heartbreak. But it had also been a journey of redemption, of forgiveness, of a love that had conquered all. The final confrontation had not been with guns or outlaws, but with their own hearts, with their own fears, with their own doubts. They had emerged victorious, their love stronger, their bond unbreakable. The horizons that stretched before them were vast and unknown, but they faced them together, hand in hand, heart to heart, ready to embrace whatever the future held. The setting sun, a fiery ball of orange and red, dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the happy couple, a silent blessing on their union, a promise of a long and fulfilling life together. Epilogue. Years passed and Abilene flourished. The schoolhouse became a center of learning and community, a testament to Dell and Gideon's vision. Children laughed and played in the streets, their faces bright with hope and opportunity. The town, once scarred by violence and betrayal, had healed, had grown, had become a place of peace and prosperity. Dell and Gideon's love deepened with each passing year. They built a home, a ranch just outside of town, a place where they could raise their children, surrounded by the beauty of a vast, open landscape. They had 2 children, a boy named Jack, after Dell's first love, and a girl named Sarah, after the young woman who had helped them escape from jail. They often sat on their porch, watching the sunset, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude. They had weathered many storms, had faced countless challenges, but their love had endured, had grown stronger with each passing year. One evening, as they sat watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Dell turned to Gideon, her eyes sparkling with love. "Remember that first day you rode into town?" she asked, a smile playing on her lips. Gideon nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "How could I forget?" he said. "You looked like you were ready to shoot me." Dell laughed, a warm, joyful sound. She said. "I thought you were going to take me back to my past." "And I thought you were the deadliest widow in the West," Gideon said, chuckling. They reminisced about their journey, about the dangers they had faced, the betrayals they had overcome, the love they had found. They spoke of Jack, of Bartholomew, of Reno, of Sheriff Thompson, of all the people who had shaped their lives for better or for worse. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Dell said, her voice filled with emotion. Gideon squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with love. "We have," he said, "and I wouldn't trade it for anything." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Dell and Gideon sat in comfortable silence, their hearts filled with peace, with contentment, with a love that had spanned decades, that had defied all odds. They had found their redemption, their happiness, their forever, in the heart of the Wild West, in a town called Abilene. The vast, open sky, a witness to their journey, stretched above them, a silent promise of the enduring power of love, of forgiveness, of second chances. The laughter of their grandchildren echoed in the evening air, a testament to the legacy they had built, a legacy of love, of courage, of a life well lived. The end.